All right, so our goal for today is to talk about how do we see this major change in U.S. politics in 1980. So first of all, without looking at the presidential timeline, so everyone put your blinders on, we're going to go all the way back to Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Think, when was he elected? Don't say it out loud, just think first. In what year was FDR first elected? In what year was FDR first elected? Think. I'll give you a hint. He came after Hoover, and Hoover was the last president elected in the 1920s. When was FDR elected? Anyone tell me? 1932. Very good. He's going to be elected 4 whole times. So he's elected again in 1936, and then in 1940, and then in 1944, and then darn it if he doesn't die. So then who in 1945 becomes the new president? It's Harry Truman, and Harry Truman is going to serve then from 1944 until, well, 1945, until 1948. Good. And then he's going to get reelected on his own. So he'll then serve until 1952, and then who becomes the president? It's Dwight D. Eisenhower. And then Eisenhower is going to serve 2 full terms, because at that point that's as most that you can serve, right, because of the which amendment? 22nd. Good. So Eisenhower serves 2 full terms. That means that we're going to elect somebody new in the year 1960. Very good. 8 years after 1952. So then in 1960, who is elected?
My boy.
Yes, John F. Kennedy. Kennedy only serves 3 years, though, before he's assassinated. And then who assumes the presidency? Lyndon Johnson. Johnson then will serve as president from 1963 until 1964, when he's elected again on his own right. And then he served 64 to 68. Could he have run again? Did he run again? So who becomes president in 1968? Nixon. Nixon serves 1 full term, gets reelected in 1972, but then there's this whole thing called, and then he's not president anymore, darn that, in 1976. And so then who takes over for Nixon in 1976? Wait, did I do that wrong? 70, 68, 72, no, it's 74. He served 6 years. So in 74, Gerald Ford takes over for Richard Nixon. Ford serves only 2 years because he doesn't win the election when it comes up in 1976. Who wins that election? Jimmy Carter. Carter serves how many terms? Just the 1. That means we're ready for a new president in the year 1980. And who's going to be our new president? It is Ronald Reagan. He is a Republican from California. He represents, or sort of speaks for this traditional, family values kind of ideology. He's going to run on the slogan, "We're going to make America great again." Really, he does. That's on his campaign posters. He also says things like, "It's morning in America." He's very hopeful and bright, which is a thing after the 1970s. Anybody want to go back to the 1970s? It sounds like a good decade. I mean, maybe marginally better from the 1870s. It sounds absolutely terrible. But the 1970s was rough, right? The economy was struggling, and then there was all of this, Vietnam stuff that was still going on. And then, the whole world seemed like it was, going crazy, because there's the killing fields, and then there's the Iranian hostage crisis, and so on and so forth. Plus, we don't trust our government because of Watergate and all that kind of mess. So the 70s was pretty rough. So for Reagan to come out with this very hopeful, enthusiastic, optimistic, demeanor, people really latched on to that. He won in a landslide. Can you think of another president who came into office after a pretty rough time, and he was hopeful and excited, and we're going to take care of this, it's going to be great? It was FDR, right? So Happy Days Are Here Again was his campaign song. So there are definitely some similarities there in terms of the, I don't want to go as far as to say the cult of personality. We use that when we talk about dictators. But this strong consumer or personality link to the people in America. Anyway, so Reagan's going to be elected, and it's going to begin an era of strong conservatism. The 1980s are strongly conservative. Politically, they're conservative. Socially, we see a rise in many conservative ideas, although certainly there's hangovers from the liberal, literally and metaphorically, I guess I should say, from the liberal decades. We're going to see economic values change. So the 1980s are strongly conservative, and our kind of question today is why is that? First thing, I have another sad story to tell you about Carter. Remember, what's this a picture of? Yeah, those are the Iranian hostages. And you remember that Carter was president when the Iranian hostage crisis began. It had a little bit to do with him, actually, because he was, couldn't stand to send the Shah back to be executed when he was so sick with cancer. And so he kept the Shah here, and then the Iranians were even madder at us. And so they started this whole hostage crisis thing. Anyway, you want to know when the hostages are released? Approximately 5 minutes after Reagan is inaugurated. I wish I could make that up. The Iranians waited, vindictively, until Carter was out of office before they released the hostages, so he couldn't claim any part in their release. So of course Reagan's first order of business is to claim victory. I freed the hostages. That's a lie. You just were inaugurated. But anyway, poor Carter. He's such a nice guy. I feel badly for him on a whole bunch of levels. But anyway, okay, so Reagan will now come into office and sort of take over. So there's been this conservative resurgence, but let's talk about why. Why would we see all of these really strong conservative groups, we'll talk about a couple of them in a few minutes, that are going to all of a sudden get all this political power in the 1980s? Can you tell me? Okay, there's certainly frustration with the Great Society and all these other big government programs, holdovers from the New Deal. They're expensive, taxes have been high, the economy is struggling, it feels like they're not really working anyway. So there is a bit of a frustration that these big government programs are giving the national government too much power and costing too much, and they're not doing anything really helpful. What else? Why else might we see this conservative resurgence? Well, we saw a little bit of this year, right? History is yet to show if this is going to be a thing that has begun or if this is just sort of a blip on the radar. But after 8 years of President Obama, there's a significant change, right? Donald Trump is elected. There's a whole bunch of interesting things that happen politically speaking. What are some of the factors behind that? Can you make some comparisons? Yeah, there's a little bit of that. So if we try to make it go backwards into the to 1980, we can talk about how Carter was a terrible president. His whole buck up guys and put on a sweater speech or whatever, which did not go over so well. The Malaise address, they called it. Anyway, so there's frustration with Carter, which is going to help give support to the Republicans because Carter was a Democrat. What else? Yeah, a little bit. I think we can kind of connect it to the Great Society programs and kind of their failure. That these sort of liberal decades, because of course if you don't count Carter, then right before Reagan, because he was sort of hate is such a strong word for being a nice guy. People didn't like him that much. But except for those 4 years of Carter, there had been 8 years of Republican before, right? Nixon was a Republican, and Ford, his vice president, was Republican as well. So it's not like we've necessarily we're building off of a whole bunch of anti-Democrat sentiment in general. What else are people mad about? Well, these days it was a lot of 2016. There was an anti-immigrant kind of nativist thing happening, but in the 80s, 70s, and 80s. Yeah, there's an anti-civil rights kind of backlash, right? We've had too much movement to improve civil rights, and we're now we're having reverse racism, and we're ignoring the needs of people, and we're lifting up people who aren't deserving just so we can say that there's diversity, and that the civil rights have gone too far. What else? Only probably the most controversial court case, yes, right? Roe v. Wade and the idea of abortion, we can point more broadly to the Supreme Court of the 60s and 70s. Who were the two chief justices in the 60s and 70s? Earl Warren and Warren Burger, right? So we can point more broadly to their court as a whole because they do a lot of things that make big changes, right? There's the rights of the criminally accused, like Matt versus Ohio and Gideon versus Wainwright and Miranda versus Arizona, helping these criminals, so to speak, to protect them from the justice system. And then of course there are civil rights cases, which expanded. We've already talked about that a little bit. But no single court case was more galvanizing than Roe v. Wade. Because for the American conservatives, the idea of legalizing abortion, requiring abortion to be legalized, was something they just could not handle. So we actually saw a huge increase in conservative political activism. So before this, we had lots of conservative religious groups in America, many of which were very active, regionally speaking, but they weren't a national political movement. But Roe v. Wade really turns religion political in a way that almost nothing else has in our country's history. So Roe v. Wade was a significant turning point in getting those conservative religious groups involved in politics. Well, now we're going to get involved. Now we need to try to get a new president elected. Now we need to try and change Congress. Now we need to try to legislatively, combat this thing that they believed was so problematic. So Roe v. Wade was one of those really big pieces. And then more broadly, we kind of got at this a little bit like the failing Great Society programs, but just more broadly, the economy is struggling. The 70s was a really rough time for the economy. And just generally speaking, when the economy has been struggling, we tend to see pushback against the party that is, we just tend to see a big change that occurs after that. We can compare the coming of the Republican Party in the 1980s to the Republican Party's rise in the 1920s, right? So in the 1920s, this was after World War I, and the progressive era had been trying to make all these changes, and people were just kind of tired of all of that, and they were ready to, have more economic prosperity again. They were ready to, just stop trying so hard in terms of solving the world's problems. There's a bit of similarity there as well. So anyway, I'm talking about some of those groups. One of the most important groups you need to know is called the moral majority, and that's capital letters. This is like a proper noun. The moral majority. The moral majority is a religious, conservative, political group. They're an interest group. Their primary goal is to affect politics, to try and translate their religious beliefs into political action. And they're led by this guy. His name is the Reverend Jerry Falwell, which is spelled like it sounds, F-A-L-W-E-L-L. The Reverend Jerry Falwell. The moral majority, led by Jerry Falwell. And this, again, the moral majority is probably the most public of those religious groups that are going to be campaigning against lots of issues, especially Roe v. Wade. They're going to really be working on that front. There's the Heritage Foundation, Focus on the Family. They still exist today. You can know them or not. And then the NRA, the National Rifle Association. So the NRA had been, and really in the early 80s, still was primarily like a sportsman's organization. Their magazine focused almost exclusively on hunting and sharpshooting and gun safety. They really weren't hugely political in any sort of stretch of the imagination. But by the late 80s, the NRA, because of cultural shifts, the kinds of people who own guns also tended to be sort of politically conservative anyway, and then a whole bunch of other things like the rise of the conversation about gun control. The NRA is going to become a political organization like we know it today, where the NRA is primarily an interest group whose job is to, or whose goal is to affect legislation to prevent the enactment of most gun control bills. So this is going to be a thing that happens in the 1980s. So as an example of that, I wanted to turn you towards the Supreme Court of the 1980s. It was led by a guy named William Rehnquist, who was appointed by Reagan. His name is over here, Rehnquist. So Ronald Reagan appoints a new Supreme Court Chief Justice. Who's he replacing? Warren Burger, right? It's good to start with Warren because you never know. You can wait until I smile to figure out if it's right or not. Burger, I don't know. I should know. Maybe he dies. Maybe he resigns. Not sure. But Burger leaves, one way or the other. And then Reagan gets to appoint a new Chief Justice. His name is William Rehnquist. And Rehnquist is going to preside over a decidedly more conservative court than either the Warren or the Burger courts. While we're on the subject, Ronald Reagan also appoints the first female Supreme Court Justice afterwards. She's not first, Rehnquist is first. But and who's that? It's Sandra Day O'Connor. So Sandra Day O'Connor was the first female Supreme Court Justice, and she was appointed by Reagan. Sandra Day O'Connor. But while we're here, Rehnquist presides over this court that is more conservative. But you should know that the Rehnquist court doesn't undo all the stuff that the Burger and the Warren courts had done. Some conservatives hope they would. They hope they'd repeal Roe v. Wade, for example. But they don't do that. They just sort of walk things back. And I think that Planned Parenthood versus Casey is a really good example of how that works. This is another case about abortions. You might remember from your work packet thingy that in Roe v. Wade there was a 3-trimester system, right? The decision says that you absolutely cannot do anything. States cannot limit abortions in any way in the first trimester. And in the second trimester they can have some limitations, but only to protect the health of the mother. Nothing that bans abortions, just so they can have regulations to protect mother's health. And then in the third trimester, you could ban abortion so long as you allow women's exception for the life of the mother. But anyway, So that's the rules as they originally stood in Roe v. Wade. But in the intervening decades, that was 73, by 1991, when Planned Parenthood versus Casey comes to the Supreme Court, many conservative states had, 91. Yeah, so this comes like after Reagan's out of office, but it's the Rehnquist court. So in 1991, when this case finally gets to the Supreme Court, many conservative states had been enacting rules that were obviously meant to discourage abortions. Right? Roe v. Wade said they couldn't ban abortions, but they tried to do all kinds of things to reduce the number of women who would receive them. So things like you have to have a 24-hour waiting period. If you want an abortion, to come to the abortion office or whatever, have your pre-exam done, answer questions, blood work drawn, whatever it is, and then you have to go away for 24 hours to think about it or whatever. And then come back, and then you can have the abortion done. So you can't have it done the same day you arrive. You have to wait 24 hours in order to do that. Then there were some laws that required women to view sonograms or to have their doctors read information to them about fetal development. So the fetus is now able to do this and is now able to do that and can do this. And here's a picture of your baby and here's the head and here's the whatever. So those kinds of things. Other laws required things like parental notification. So if it was a minor, their parents had to consent to the abortion. Or spousal notification. So if you were married, your husband had to give you permission to get an abortion. And so all of this went before the Supreme Court in this case, Planned Parenthood versus Casey, to see, because of course abortion rights advocates believe that these were violating Roe v. Wade, that they were placing limitations on women's access to abortions in the first trimester, which was completely unallowed. But the Rehnquist court, remember, is more conservative. And so they review the case, and their language is, they say, so long as there is no undue burden, that's the words they use, so long as there is no undue burden, then the states can kind of do what they want to, so long as they don't place an undue burden. So for example, if I really want an abortion, is it going to stop me from getting an abortion to have to listen to somebody tell me about fetal development? No, I can still get my abortion. If I really wanted an abortion, is it going to stop me from getting an abortion to have to wait 24 hours? That is more controversial because for some people maybe. But anyway, basically no, if you really want one, they're asking you to wait 1 day, not 6 months. So, surely that would be reasonable. So long as there's no undue burden, it's going to be okay. So you can see they don't overturn Roe v. Wade. You still can't ban abortion. And in fact, they do strike down one particular provision. It was called spousal consent. You could not force a woman to get her husband's permission to have an abortion, because women are not property of their husbands. So there's that. Although parental permission was still allowed. So it doesn't get rid of Roe v. Wade, but it does sort of walk it back and say, okay, the states can regulate. There are some things that they can do. So this is just an example of how the Rehnquist court takes lots of those decisions from the Warren and Burger courts and begins to make them a little bit less dramatic. So tomorrow we're going to be talking about Reaganomics, so I'm going to kind of skip this for now. You're going to do an activity of a whole bunch of graphs and charts that you're going to be looking at to review, because I don't want to tell you how Reaganomics works. I want you to figure it out and interpret it for yourself, because Reaganomics is kind of like the New Deal, where society kind of has this idea of whether it was good or bad, but I want you to kind of figure that out for yourself. So we're going to do this more, but just know that Reagan has to deal with stagflation as well. So we still have this same problem. Unemployment is high, inflation is high, and how are we supposed to deal with that? How are we supposed to help revive the economy? Carter couldn't do it, Ford couldn't do it, Nixon couldn't do it. What is Reagan going to do? So we'll look at some of that a little bit later. So a few things that we want to talk about. Reagan is very conservative. One of the things that means is he wants a smaller government. One of the things he says in his first speech is that government is not the solution to the problem, government is the problem. And so we'll talk about how he cuts some programs but leaves Social Security alone Wednesday, I think. Thanks.